Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Propagation is a huge part of my plant care or my plant journey. I love propagating my plants and I really embrace chopping them up. Seems counterintuitive, right? Because as soon as you start chopping your plants, you would assume that you're setting them back in progress a little bit. Well, if propagation is done right, that's not the case at all. So in this video, I want to talk to you about the experiences I have made in propagating my aroids over the last 3 years. Really just focusing on aroids today because propagation in itself is a huge topic. I've only made experiences propagating aroids, predominantly Alocasias, Syngoniums, Anthuriums, Monsteras, Philodendron. Those are really the ones that I have propagated over the years. And I just want to pass on a few handy tips and tricks that I've learned over the years. There's two types of propagation. There's sexual propagation and asexual propagation. So sexual propagation is if you use a flower and you pollinate the flower, grows to seeds, you germinate the seeds, and so on. So you're basically reproducing a plant through its flower. Sexual reproduction of plants has huge advantages. It increases the gene pool, which is really essential for survival of the fittest. If you never increase the gene pool of a species, then you are running risk of the entire species having the exact same DNA, being very vulnerable to any sort of threats like diseases, bacteria, and so on. So we want to have a well-diversified gene pool within any species. I mean, it's the same with all organisms for that matter, but it also applies to plants. So sexual reproduction via seed has the advantage that it just gives you a little bit more variety. From an aesthetic point of view, means that you might find some very interesting variations of a plant. Some variation that you would never get if you just continuously reproduce the plant through chopping it up. Sexual reproduction is probably the hardest one to do in an indoor environment or to do as a hobbyist, but I have been successful with it, specifically with Anthuriums, and I suppose those are the most common ones you see being done indoors. So these are Anthurium seedlings that I have created myself. This over here, Anthurium crystallinum, is the mother plant and the father plant for that matter. So I waited until it had 2 inflows. I pollinated the inflow with the other inflow, with the pollen from the other inflow. I waited for it to have berries. The berries have seeds. I then germinate the seeds and grow them on just moss into these little seedlings. I have made a full video on this journey from inflow all the way to a full pot of seedlings, which I will link at the end screen. So sexual reproduction can be a bit tricky. Anthuriums seem to be the easiest one. It's definitely time consuming, but if you get it right, you get an absorbent amount of new little seedlings. Now, I believe Anthuriums are the easiest ones to do that with. Monsteras, Philodendron, Alocasias, Syngoniums, they all work in the same way, but they seem to be a little bit harder to actually do. Or at least in my opinion, or at least from what I've heard from others, Anthuriums seem to be the easiest one. So if you're interested in trying to create your own seeds, I would recommend you start with an Anthurium. And again, I will link the in-depth video at the end screen. So let's move on from sexual propagation and let's talk about asexual propagation. So asexual propagation is basically us taking a plant and reproducing the plant by using parts of the plant itself. Why would I even want to do asexual propagation? I mean, with sexual propagation, it makes sense. Maybe you want to create hybrids between 2 different plants. So for you to create a hybrid, you have to do sexual reproduction and use the egg and the pollen from 2 different species. Maybe you just want to reproduce large amounts and you want a little bit of variety, you want to make a species more resilient and so on. So sexual reproduction makes total sense from a functionality perspective. But why would you want to do asexual reproduction? Well, my intentions behind propagating are varied. Sometimes I propagate because I want to swap a plant for another plant. Or I want to sell a plant and then use the funds to purchase a plant that's been on my wish list for a long time. But most of the time, I want to propagate my plants for aesthetic reasons. I want to create a certain display. I might want to create a really lush display with lots of plants in it, rather than just having one empty vine trailing. No offense to anybody who likes that. Aesthetics are different, but I absolutely hate these really long vining pothos that are kind of just crawling along the ceiling and the floor and whatever, and it's just one 10-meter long vine with like lots of internodal spacing and teeny tiny leaves far in between. To me, that is not really aesthetically pleasing. To me, that's not really what I want my plant displays to look like. If that's what you're after, then yeah, you might not ever have to propagate. But I personally like to have a more compact, lush display of my plants, and I obviously also like to grow my plants to maturity. So for me, propagating is a really important tool to actually grow my plants in the way that I want them to look like. And the other reason why I propagate is because, well, I'm running out of space. If I think about the propagations and the plants that have left my place over the last 3 years, if I would have kept all of them and all of them would have continued to grow, I probably couldn't set foot in this apartment anymore, right? So for me, propagating is also a way to keep my plants at a manageable size so that I can keep a lot of them. All right, enough about the reasons why. Let's talk about how I actually do it. So to propagate an aroid, you need a node. Plants like begonias, for example, they could be propagated just through a leaf. You could just cut off a leaf, stick it in a medium, and it should reshoot. Aroids will always need a node. So a node is basically the section where the petiole intersects with the stem. So that's where the growth point comes from. That's where the roots come from. And if you don't have a node, that plant will never root and then also reshoot. So you need a node. So on this cutting of Syngonium, variegated Syngonium, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the 5th node is up here, but the 5th node does not have any aerial roots yet. So to propagate this, you take clean scissors or a sharp knife, and I just cut between the stem pieces. So that would be single node cuttings. There you go. So these are 3 single node cuttings over here. So it's just a leaf, a node, and some roots. What I do with those, I'll let them dry out for maybe 2 to 3 hours, just for the cuts to callus over a little bit. And then I would just pop them in water. Now, I've seen people put wax on the cuts, or put it in cinnamon, or put it in activated charcoal, or putting in rooting hormone. To me, they all go into the too hard basket. I just let them dry out for a couple of hours, and then I pop them in water, and then the roots will just go crazy. Water actually has a lot of oxygen in it. It's H2O. So roots actually really like being propagated in water, and I personally have found the least risk of root rot if I propagate in water. Plus, I have visibility of exactly what's going on. I know exactly what's happening in here, and that just lets me know whether or not my propagation is successful. I don't like propagating straight in potting medium because, well, then I don't necessarily see if my propagation is successful and I can't take actions accordingly. So I do like to use water. Definitely for all of my Monsteras, I always use water. For my Syngoniums, I would always use water. For most of my Philos, I would use water. But sometimes I also like to use moss. But we're talking about moss in a second. Anthuriums, I would probably always propagate in moss. But honestly, I feel like either way works. With moss, you just need to be more careful that there's plenty of aeration so you don't overwater it and your cutting isn't sitting in soggy moss. With water, you just need to make sure that you switch out the water every once in a while. I know that people on the internet say, switch out your water every 3 to 5 days. I honestly, I think I switch out water maybe once every 2 months, and I haven't really seen any issues with it, right? Maybe if I'd switch out the water more frequently, then maybe I would see faster results, but honestly, I'm just a bit too lazy to do that. So I usually just top up the water because obviously the plants use a little bit. So I just top it up, but I don't actually switch it around. Sometimes I put a bit of fertilizer in there, a fertilizer that's more focused on root health rather than foliage health. So GT has a product called CCS. I sometimes put that in there, but also just very occasionally. To be honest, I think when it comes to propagating in water, I would rather keep it simple. All you really need is water. I don't think everything else is absolutely needed. Doesn't mean that it's not working, but you can totally be successful with just using water, what I usually do. Now, the tip cutting, I actually left both nodes on here because if I would cut this here, that That bottom node would be fine, but the top cutting would most likely die. In general, I don't like tip cuttings. Before I cut it, that tip cutting had a whole plant beneath it to actually support it, and it was sending growth hormones into that top node, and there is a new leaf waiting in that petiole over here. Now that I cut it, this is going to go through quite a bit of shock, and it's quite likely that that new leaf over here might actually, the plant might actually abort it, so it might rot. So I don't really like tip cuttings. They're actually my least favorite to propagate. So if I take a tip cutting, I would never take a single node tip cutting. I would at least have 2 nodes, just so that there's 2 nodes that can root and hopefully produce enough roots for the plant to survive. I like stem cuttings. With stem cuttings, of course, now that we cut it, this plant doesn't have a whole lot of energy available. It needs to produce a root system first, and then once it has a root system, it will start producing leaves. But the first few leaves will obviously be quite small because it doesn't have that much energy available to push out large leaves yet. But usually the size of the new growth is pretty much determined by the size of the stem and obviously the size of the root system. If you already have a decent root system, then your new growth will be larger. If you have a thicker stem, then your new growth will also be larger. But it will still always revert back to being more juvenile purely because, well, you just gave it a bit of shock by cutting it. So I put these aside, I let them dry for a couple of hours, and then I just popped them in a glass of water. Now, that whole problem that I just discussed about basically now that I cut it, the plant needing to focus back on its root system, that is basically what makes the plant revert back to juvenile. So to avoid that from happening, which is basically what I'm trying to do at all times, I'm trying to establish a root system for that cutting before it becomes a cutting. All right, let's have a look at this Philodendron verrucosum. So that is my second Philodendron verrucosum, and I'll tell you the story about it in a sec. But I first want to focus on a concept called air layering. So you'll see that this plant has reached the top of its moss pole, it keeps growing, and this new growth is now kind of just floating mid-air, right? Nothing wrong with that, but if I keep letting it float mid-air, eventually it doesn't have support to hold itself up again. It might actually just snap itself, or it will definitely stop increasing in leaf size because it has less support available. Also, up here, you might be able to see that there are a bunch of aerial roots coming out of that node, but because the aerial roots have nothing to go into, they just dry out because the air around here isn't humid enough. If it was in 100% humidity, these roots wouldn't dry out. They would obviously do their job. That's what they're supposed to do in the rainforest. But in an indoor environment, it's very unlikely that you're going to have aerial roots just in the air and not eventually dry out. So what I want to do is, well, I want to chop this because it reached the top of its moss pole. I want to chop it and I want to take it and I want to pop it back into the pot. But right now, if I'd cut it right now, it doesn't have any roots yet. So this leaf is going to have a hard time surviving because, well, where is it going to get water and energy from? That growth point is going to have a hard time growing, and this caterpillar is most likely going to be aborted because, well, the plant is saving energy and putting the energy into the root system first, and then once it has established a root system, then it will grow a new shoot. So I don't want to cut it right now because, well, it's going so strong, plus it has the support of the whole plant beneath it at the moment. So I want to take advantage of that, but I want to start growing this plant into its own little plant, and then once I feel like it's there, then I'm going to chop it. That process is basically called air layering. So air layering is a process of you propagating the plant while it's still attached to its mother plant, and then you chop it. So basically the opposite of what I've done with that Syngonium. The Syngonium, I chopped it first, and now I'm trying to grow a root system. Basically the idea is that I want to get some growing medium around this node so the plant can start growing roots into it. I'm going to use just a nursery pot that I slit open on one side so I can fit it around the plant like this. I take a bit of sticky tape, just sticky tape the cut back, and now I just want to fill this with moss. You can do this with a Ziploc bag. You could do this with, I mean, you can actually go on Amazon and find these little, it's almost like little Christmas ornaments. They look like Christmas ornaments that you just like flip open, put the medium in it, and then flip it close it around the node. So there are some, you know, I mean, you can totally go fancy on this. I usually just use Ziploc bags or one of these pots because that's just the easiest. Now, I could also go ahead and kind of support this cup onto the moss pole so it doesn't get too heavy and drag the plant down, but because it's just moss, this shouldn't be all too heavy. This should be fine. So now I just want to make sure that I keep the moss nice and moist so that these roots can find their way into the moss. And because I used a clear pot, I can actually see once the air layering has been successful, the roots will start pushing towards the outside of the pot. And then once I feel like there's enough of a root system within that pot, I can just chop it and it's already its own little plant with an established root system. So we're reducing the chances of this reverting back to juvenile and aborting its growth point. So that process is called air layering. But you can make this so much more efficient by just growing your plant on a moss pole in the first place. This whole plant is already air layered. There are actually 4 plants on here, and every single node has grown roots into the moss pole. So essentially, the moss pole is taking the functionality of this little cup up here. So what I could do right now is I could chop between every single node over here. Not take the moss pole apart yet. Every single node has already grown a root system into the plant, and then every single node can now use that root system to start pushing out a new growth point. And then once you see the new growth, then you can either, you know, take the moss pole apart and pot them up on a new moss pole, and now maybe have 5 plants growing on that moss pole. And that's exactly what I've done with this plant. So this plant started off as a 1 node cutting about 1 year ago. I took that 1 node cutting and I grew it up a grow vertical pole. It grew about, I think, 5 nodes. Out of those, I then cut between the 5 nodes, turning it into 5 different small plants. Each of those plants gave me a new shoot. I then took the grow vertical pole apart and put 4 out of those 5 plants in a pot on a new moss pole. And this is what I now ended up with. So I turned a single node cutting into a lush pole with 4 fully established plants. If I now do that again, let's say every single cutting has grown up the pole and grown another 5 nodes, I cut in between, each node is going to reshoot, I'll end up with 20 cuttings. I'll take them, I grow them up a moss pole again. Each grows 5 leaves, I cut them into bits. I now have 100 cuttings, right? So it's a really fast way for you to produce more and more plants. Now, what you're going to do with all of these plants is totally up to you. I personally like adding multiple plants on a moss pole so that each moss pole is nice and lush. Because especially with these ones, for example, they can have really large internodal spacing, but if I have multiple plants on there, they kind of fill the gaps quite nicely. I hope that made sense. That was obviously me using the moss pole to air layer every single node, cut it into single node pieces and so on. But with that approach, we will always just create a lush display. We won't necessarily create really large mature plants because we're continuously chopping them. And if you keep chopping your plants back to single node cuttings, even if each single node cutting in itself starts becoming larger and larger over time, you're going to have to be really, really patient for you to actually grow that plant to maturity. So in reality, I don't do that all too often. I actually just do that at the very beginning. When I first get a plant, I want to multiply it as quickly as possible so that I can then have 5 plants growing instead of just 1. To me, it makes sense. If I want to get the most benefit out of that plant in the long term, then I should really propagate it as soon as possible so I can then grow on multiple of the same plant. So multiple can grow in the same way that just 1 could have grown. But most of the times, my goal is to really grow my plants to maturity. And for me to grow to maturity, I really want to minimize cutting it because with every cutting, I'm setting it back. So I really only want to cut my plants once they start becoming too large for my environment. So that's where I use a method called chop and extend. And it's basically the exact same process. It's still propagating via division. It's still propagating by me taking a cut. And it's taken advantage of the principles that air layering takes advantage of. But instead of taking single node cuttings, I just take 1 big cutting. So my chop and extend method, maybe I'll explain it using that Adansonii behind me over here. It's on a 180 centimeter moss pole. and that moss pole is basically made out of two 90-centimeter segments. Once the plant reaches the top of the moss pole, every single node would have rooted into the moss pole. I chop the top half off, I take the top half, I pot it back into a pot, and then I re-extend it. That top half is the part that has the biggest growth, the nicest looking leaves, the fresh leaves that just popped out. The bottom half, well, those are the leaves that are the oldest. They slowly start fading in color a little bit. They start yellowing a little bit around the edges. Plus, they're the smallest ones. So they are not necessarily the ones I want to keep on growing. I want to keep on growing the nice lush part at the top. Now, if I would have just taken a single node cutting from the top of the pole, potted back onto a moss pole, it would revert back to being fairly juvenile because, well, I'm taking a single node cutting with a very small root system. However, if I take the full top half of the moss pole with, let's say, 10 to 15 nodes potentially even, and every single node would have rooted into the moss pole, I actually take a very large cutting with a very large root system already. So that plant is going to have a really easy time re-establishing itself after the chop and extend, expanding its root system into the pot, and then keep growing up that moss pole. Yes, you'll probably see a slight decrease in leaf size, which you can probably see over here a little bit. Halfway up the pole, it started decreasing, but then it increases again. Every time you do chop, there might be some sort of shock and some sort of reduction in leaf size, but the larger the root system is that is still attached to the plant and the larger the cutting in itself is, the less likely you will have extreme setbacks. Now, another thing that is very interesting, when I do take the top half and I pot it back up, well, the bottom half is still perfectly fine. It still has a pot, a moss pole, a lot of leaves, and a large root system throughout the moss pole as well as the pot. But it doesn't have a growth point anymore. So it's very, very likely that after you chop the top bits off and the plant needs to redistribute its growth hormones again, that it will reshoot in multiple spots. So far from experience, I would say that in like 70% of the times it actually reshoots in multiple spots. So despite that you just took a cutting, well, you took that cutting is perfectly fine, it's going to keep surviving. You also just created basically, well, you already made one plant into two, but then one of them is now actually splitting itself up again as well. So you now potentially created 3 plants with just one quick chop. That's also a really great way for you to actually keep multiplying your plants without actually taking a full chop of the moss pole. Let's take the example of my Philodendron melanochrysum, for example. It wasn't really sizing up in the way that I wanted to, and it was looking a little bit empty on its moss pole. So I didn't give it a full chop and extend. I didn't take a single node cutting. I really just took, well, I did take a single node cutting, but it was an unviable single node cutting. I just took the cataphil, the growth top off. Now, that cataphil by itself is not going to grow. It's definitely going to die. So I didn't even really bother with that. But I didn't take the cutting for the sake of having the cutting. I actually took the cutting because I wanted the plant to redistribute its growth hormones. And what happened? Well, the one vine turned into 2 growth points, and I had 2 vines on that moss pole, so 2 vines turned into 4 growth points, and now I have 4 plants growing on my Milano. The new growth also happened to end up being much, much larger than before. So sometimes after chopping, your plant doesn't just multiply, it actually brings out the best in the plant as well. But of course, the leaf size increasing wasn't necessarily just because of the chop. It was because I chopped a plant that has a large root system and a lot of leaves available to actually produce large new growth. If you would take a single node cutting, you will never get larger growth from that single node cutting than the actual cutting that you took. On that note, pun intended, whenever I take cuttings from a moss pole, so the plant has already grown in moss, I would then also put it in moss to propagate any further. I won't take it from moss back into water. But if a plant has not previously grown on a moss pole, then I would propagate it in water. Feel free to be creative with this, right? Just keep the principle in mind. Before you take a cut, you want to optimize the root system that that node can build to reduce any sort of shock. And if you can't reduce the shock, or if you can't build a root system before you cut it, then you just need to live with the risk that, well, potentially that node could die. Because let's be realistic, we won't have 100% success. Sometimes these cuttings can just rot, specifically where you cut them, right? With every cut, you might be introducing bacteria or fungus to the plant. So make sure that your knife or scissors are really clean. So far, I basically just spoke about climbing aroids. You can take the same principle and apply it to crawling aroids as well. Just instead of the plant growing vertically and you're chopping it vertically, the plant is growing horizontally and you're just chopping it horizontally. So with crawlers, it's even easier. Every single node is crawling along the surface of the pot and growing roots into the pot. So you can just chop in between the nodes, and then every single node is going to reshoot because it already has a root system available. But there's also some plants that don't crawl nor climb. They kind of grow in clusters. So it's a little bit harder. Like anthuriums, for example, they climb really slowly, but it might be a little bit harder for you to actually see between the nodes. So with anthuriums, I would most likely go with sexual reproduction. That is what works best for me. So with alocasias as well, you can't really take single node cuttings, but alocasias propagate themselves really easily. They throw out things called corms. So they're basically like these little bulbs. They're usually underground, like over here. So if you have see-through pots, you can see them. And then they just reshoot, and suddenly you have little alocasias popping up everywhere. You can also, when you repot, just pluck all of them off. They look like these little onions almost. What I like to do with them is I actually like to peel that outer layer very gently and just reveal like a soft little looking onion. I don't know if you guys get to see this. So I like to peel it a little bit, and then I just pop it on wet moss. Before these plants grew a little bit, I actually had a little cover over it as well, so they really like humidity. And then they will start growing roots into the moss, and then eventually they will start growing little leaves. So really easy way for you to propagate your alocasias are these corms. Plus the good thing is, while you are propagating via corms, you're not actually touching the mother plant at all, right? So you're not having to chop the mother plant. It just kind of reproduces itself. But you also don't have to do all of that. You can also just leave them in there and let nature do its own thing, and eventually you will have new little alocasias popping up left, right, and center out of your pots, hopefully. All right, so these are all of the propagation techniques I have used myself in relation to propagating aroids. If there's one key message that I want you to get out of this video, is to embrace the chop. I have had so many people come to me saying that they're really nervous about, chopping their plant. It's their little baby. They've been looking after it for years and they're worried about hurting it. And so many people come back to me a few months later saying, like, why was I ever nervous about chopping my plants? It's actually the best thing that has happened to me. Suddenly I have so many plants, I'm able to sell them, swap them, and create a larger collection for myself with plants that I would have never been able to afford if I wouldn't have chopped up some of my plants. So once you start embracing the chop, I think you can really take your plant hobby to the next level by selling, swapping, by really optimizing the aesthetic look of some of your displays as well. So please, please, please embrace the chop. I'll link 2 videos for you over here. I'll link the video where I made anthurium seedlings, and I will also link my chop and extend full tutorial where you can see how I go about chopping and extending these larger moss poles. I hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something from it. Like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment, and I'll see you in my next video.